do an interpretive dance, but I felt like,
come on, Monique, go Monique.
But I didn't want to be subjected to interpretation.
I get a bounce going, you know. Go.
So yeah, okay, you're not gonna get it. But a little bit about my organization. But before I get into that, let me just welcome everyone to this space for a long overdue conversation about climate justice, what it means in our lives, in our communities, and what we can do to make sure that people are at the center of the climate debate that's right now brewing in Washington, D.C., and will be upcoming in Copenhagen, Denmark, in the international treaty talks around climate. Advocates for environmental human rights is all about upholding the human right to live in a healthy environment. And long before climate change, this human right has been violated in our country by the system of what we call environmental protection. In Louisiana, as an example of what's going on across the nation, we have lost 5 historic African American communities that were founded, some of them before the Civil War, that no longer exist because of our environmental protection system. The communities of Bel Air, Sunrise, Revealtown, Morrisonville, and Diamond no longer exist. And that's because of this huge Cancer Alley section and Cancer Alley section in 2 portions of our state. Between just outside of New Orleans all the way up to Baton Rouge, there's some 200 petrochemical facilities. In the southwest section where the folks from Mossville, next to the town of Lake Charles live, there's some 60 facilities. And in Mossville, they have 14 of those facilities in close proximity to their homes, churches, schools, and playgrounds. Along the coastal section of our state of Louisiana, we've got indigenous communities that are suffering from land erosion and coastal erosion as a result of our oil and gas industry. But this is our time. This is our time to work together for a just climate policy. This is an opportunity for us to learn from each other, the experiences we've gained before and after Katrina, and what that means for informing and bringing our voice into this climate policy. And preparing ourselves to share this information with our neighbors, our families, our churches, members of our organizations, networks, coalition members, all so that we can build a base for policies that will affect our lives and will be affecting our lives into the future. I think after Katrina, we all realized, and what I mean by after Katrina, that includes Rita, Gustav, Ike, and what will be forthcoming in the future. It's really about protecting the places that we call home. And the power's on our side. There's nothing stronger than love. There's nothing stronger than love. And if you love the place that you call home, if you love your families, if you love your life and your communities, you're going to fight like the devil to maintain them. And so this is an opportunity at this conference to get more information and resources about how we can build that fight. I am just so happy that the folks here come from a broad array of expertise areas, from reproductive justice, environmental justice, housing, I'm just looking around the room, environmental quality, energy, health justice, all seeing climate and climate policy as something that's really centered to what we do. It's not, we're not a limited, diverse group. We are a very broad group of people coming from around the nation to this gathering, and knowing that there are so many other gatherings that are taking place just like this around this country. With that in mind, we should be very mindful of the fact that those who want to insist that global warming or climate change doesn't exist, or that oil and gas industries are good for the environment, they're desperate. They're desperate, and they're afraid of the change that we know is needed. Long before there was news about climate change, we knew this was needed. In those communities that I just mentioned to you in Louisiana as an example, those communities were displaced in the mid-1990s. What I want to just focus on for just a bit in this welcome address, and I know I'm probably losing time here, is the real severe cost of climate change in our communities, which is displacement. The fact that you can't come back home. There is no home for you anymore. And the ways that can happen by sheer dint of the damage that can be brought on by disastrous weather, as well as disaster profiteering as we're experiencing now in this region after the storms. When we talk about climate policy, we've got to go beyond emissions arguments. We've got to talk about it in terms of how do we ensure that communities can be sustained and resilient? How can we ensure the rights of people to be able to restore their lives and, if feasible, restore their communities? That's got to be central in the kinds of conversations we have here today. I just want to leave you with two specific pieces of input into this conversation. One is that we can't talk about the solutions to climate policy as just green jobs. The solutions have got to be very regulatory in nature, and realizing that the current system of environmental protection is broken and has been broken for years. It's broken because it is based on codifying the status quo of industrial facilities. So if you look at our major environmental laws, like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, which authorize the construction and operation of these toxic facilities and environmentally damaging facilities, the only thing that they require is that a company do the same thing that other companies in its industrial sector does. That's it. That's not protecting our health, as we all know. That's not protecting the places that we call home. The second piece that I want to present to you is what happens when disaster strikes in this country. What's the regulatory framework there? It comes from the Stafford Act, and that's the law that establishes the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and bestows FEMA with the authority to create policies and regulations pursuant to the Stafford Act. But here's the catch. The Stafford Act removes all governmental accountability in a time of disaster. All of it. There are two particular provisions in the Stafford Act. The first one says that all matters of federal response are at the discretion of whoever's in the White House. And we saw what that meant with Katrina, with Bush in the White House. And if you think that that's not enough, check out the second troubling provision of the Stafford Act, which explicitly denies an individual affected by a national disaster the right to claim any assistance for water, emergency medical care, sheltering, health care, housing, trauma counseling, help to relocate records, help to connect with families. You don't have a right to that. And we saw how that's played out in the days after Katrina. For people who sued the government for failure to provide adequate assistance, those cases were dismissed. They were dismissed because the Stafford Act says it's all discretionary. For people after 9/11 who were lied to by Bush's Environmental Protection Agency and told that the air quality was fine, and now some of them have died from respiratory damage and others continue to suffer from respiratory damage, those cases were dismissed because the judiciary branch can't second guess the executive branch. The executive branch has full discretion in these matters. So what we've learned under the Stafford Act is that you can go through a national disaster and our government doesn't have any duty or obligation to you. But our government can even make the situation worse, and it's still okay under the law. And so when we talk about a climate policy, we've really got to aim at the ways in which our facilities are permitted and the ways in which people are treated in times of disaster. As, you know, under this law, and as we're talking about climate change and this conversation that's happening around green jobs, we've got to get really specific in the nuts and bolts of what that means in terms of equity and the treatment of people and the latitude that's given to toxic polluting facilities. You know, if you look at some major magazines, you'll see full page ads by Shell and BP and Chevron and ConocoPhillips talking about green jobs and a green economy. But they're going to even increasingly dirtier sources of material to refine oil, like tar sands. And that's legally permissive under the system of environmental protection that we have. So what we need is a climate policy that respects and ensures that our fundamental human rights to a healthy environment are indeed protected. And that means going beyond the current conversations of cap and trade and atmospheric conditions to the lives of people and what in the places that we call home. I think that this, you know, we shouldn't lose a minute. If there's a question that doesn't sit well with you, one of the questions that we were discussing earlier right before we got started was, well, how does this affect women more than men?